Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Let us drift back together across the profound, shining expanse of the sea, to the very cradle where Western memory was first recorded upon the shifting sands of time, long before the bronze weapons were cast or the first philosopher asked a dangerous question of the stars. We begin not with heroes or kings, but with the quiet murmur of the Aegean, where the earliest inhabitants of the islands learned to read the currents and navigate by the pale light of the moon, shaping the pure white marble into elegant, silent figures that asked for nothing and offered only repose. These were the Cycladic peoples, ephemeral yet enduring, whose gentle abstract forms suggest a world rooted in harmony and free from the monumental pride that would eventually bring down greater kingdoms, leaving us only to marvel at their simple, perfect geometry against the vast blue canvas of antiquity. Our journey deepens as we turn the prow southward toward the great island of Crete, the heartland of the Minoan civilization, a place of vibrant colors and strange bull-leaping rituals performed in the dazzling courtyards of Knossos. Here, life was organized not around fortified citadels of war, but around grand, open palaces, vast, complex structures known later as labyrinths, which served as centers of economy, art, and a sophisticated administration that kept careful track of every amphora of oil and every thread of imported purple dye. The Minoans were the first true masters of the sea, their sprawling navy safeguarding their trade routes and ensuring peace across the waves for centuries, allowing them to decorate their walls with frescoes depicting vibrant marine life, playful dolphins, and scenes of luxuriant terrestrial delight. The Minoans were the first true masters of the sea, their sprawling navy safeguarding their trade routes and ensuring peace across the waves for centuries, allowing them to decorate their walls with frescoes depicting vibrant marine life, playful dolphins, and scenes of luxuriant terrestrial delight. Yet, even a civilization built upon the liquid certainty of the sea is subject to the fiery will of the earth, and the light of Minoan dominance flickered tragically in a moment of great seismic upheaval when the catastrophic eruption of Hera sent a devastating shadow across the waves and weakened the fragile structure of their maritime empire. Though the palaces themselves survived the initial blast, the sudden disruption of trade, the loss of agricultural land, and the overwhelming shift in natural balance created a vacuum that ushered in a new and dramatically different power from the mainland, a people of massive, defensive walls and hardened bronze. The glorious, playful brightness of Minoan Crete faded like a dream, leaving behind only the cryptic script of Linear A, an untranslated voice calling across the millennia. Across the choppy waters, upon the rugged slopes of the Peloponnese, the Mycenaeans were forging a warrior society, building their citadels not for open commerce like the Minoans, but for defense and the projection of power, evidenced by the staggering Cyclopean stones used to construct the great walls of Mycenae and Tiryns. Their world was structured rigidly around the Wanox, the supreme king, who ruled from a powerful central hall, the Megaron, a place where feasting and council were conducted under the constant heavy shadow of military preparedness. These were the kings of legend, the great house of Atreus, who valued gold and bronze armor above all else, seeing life itself as a series of maneuvers, raids, and the endless accumulation of wealth taken by force. This age of bronze, heavy with the smell of ambition and fate, reached its dramatic, defining zenith in the legendary expedition against the vast city of Troy, a monumental conflict that bound the disparate kingdoms of the mainland under a single, fateful oath of alliance. The narrative of that prolonged siege, the pride of Agamemnon, the towering rage of Achilles, the cunning of Odysseus, provided the subsequent generations not merely with a history of war, but with a profound moral compass, illustrating the catastrophic costs of hubris and the inevitable, tragic intertwining of divine interference and mortal folly. The very memory of that 10-year struggle fixed the concept of the heroic pursuit, the striving for immortal fame through glorious action, into the deep, collective consciousness of the Greek world. But the age of the great kings, like all epics founded on finite resources and perpetual conflict, could not sustain itself, and a mysterious series of collapses swept across the eastern Mediterranean world, bringing the Mycenaean civilization crashing down in a sudden, violent dissolution known in the records of other lands as the descent of the Sea Peoples. Whether brought low by internal strife, widespread famine, or invasion by tribes bearing the new revolutionary technology of iron, the massive palaces were systematically burned and abandoned, their advanced administrative systems dissolving entirely into ruin. The sophisticated art of writing, Linear B, which had tracked the complex inventories of the royal stores, was utterly forgotten, plunging the world into a vast, silent gulf known appropriately as the Dark Age. For nearly 4 centuries, the great centers of power vanished, and the peoples retreated into scattered, isolated villages, surviving through subsistence farming and losing many of the crucial arts of monumental building and international trade. This profound period of contraction, though marked by material poverty and a deep silence in the archaeological record, was not an age of utter stagnation, but rather a profound period of cultural incubation, where the harsh necessities of survival forced a complete societal restructuring. The grand hierarchies of the kings gave way to simpler, more communal structures, fostering a fierce independence within the small, geographically distinct settlements, setting the stage for the revolutionary political experiments that were yet to come. When the light slowly began to creep back into the Aegean world, heralded by the slow, tentative reintroduction of overseas trade, the societal blueprint had irrevocably changed, and the memory of the absolute, divine monarch was replaced by the emerging necessity of shared responsibility. This transition marked the birth of the Archaic Age and the revolutionary concept of the polis, or the city-state, a sovereign community defined not merely by territory, but by the shared citizenship of its inhabitants, who gathered within the protective shadow of the newly built Acropolis. This profound shift, placing the law and the assembly above the solitary will of the hereditary ruler, laid the cornerstone for the very idea of Western governance. With the return of commerce came the need for efficient communication, and the Greeks adopted and ingeniously adapted the practical syllabary of the Phoenicians, transforming it into a flexible and resonant alphabet that possessed the clarity necessary for recording epic poetry and, crucially, for codifying law. The restoration of writing did more than facilitate ledgers. It acted as the great consolidator of memory, allowing the scattered fragments of the Bronze Age to be gathered and stitched together by a towering, immortal figure, Homer, who gave the Greeks a unifying voice and a shared pantheon of flawed, magnificent gods and heroes. Through the verses of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the once-forgotten past was reborn as a common heritage, forging an identity where before there had only been disparate tribes of survivors. The subsequent rapid growth in population soon compelled the fledgling polis to look beyond their narrow coastal plains, leading to the vast and ambitious period of colonization that saw Hellenic culture spread its roots across the shores of the Black Sea, southern Italy, later known as Magna Graecia, and North Africa. These colonies were not mere dependencies, but fully independent city-states, replicating the political structure of the mother city and extending the sphere of Hellenic influence until a vast network of interlinked communities spanned the entire Mediterranean basin. This diaspora fostered a new intellectual cosmopolitanism, challenging traditional assumptions and giving rise to the first tentative, systematic inquiries into the nature of the cosmos, the dawning of philosophy upon the Ionian coast. Meanwhile, back in the homeland, the internal structures of the burgeoning polis were strained by the tensions between the old aristocracy, who controlled the best land, and the newly enriched merchant class and the masses of debt-ridden farmers. This social upheaval demanded new forms of governance, leading to a period dominated by the rise of the tyrants, charismatic individuals who often seized power by championing the cause of the common people against the entrenched hereditary elite. Though often authoritarian, many of these tyrants governed with great skill, initiating monumental public works, fostering the arts, and preparing the way, sometimes unwittingly, for the more truly democratic experiments that would follow. Among these evolving city-states, two distinct and powerfully antithetical models of life began to solidify their characters. The severe, disciplined military state of Sparta, rooted deeply in the fertile Eurotas Valley, and the vibrant, artistic, and fiercely intellectual democracy emerging at Athens, overlooking the Saronic Gulf. Sparta bound its citizens to a life of relentless training, prioritizing collective obedience and martial excellence above all other pursuits. Its society structured like a perfectly honed phalanx, designed for inescapable victory on the battlefield and rigid social stability at home. Its citizens, the equals, lived under an austere code designed to eliminate self-indulgence and distraction. Athens, conversely, wrestled constantly with the complexities of freedom, undergoing cycles of reform championed by great lawgivers such as Solon, who famously abolished debt slavery and created a legal framework that balanced the power between the various classes based on property, though not birthright. His reforms were foundational, seeking to temper the harshness of aristocratic rule with justice, proving that law could be a flexible, evolving instrument rather than a static, immutable decree handed down by the gods or a single ruler. This path of continuous legal and political evolution was chaotic, but ultimately led toward an unprecedented form of government rooted in the voice of the many. The seeds of future conflict were sown not only in the differing philosophies of these two great powers, but also in the rising shadow of the vast, monolithic Persian Empire, which had already consumed the Greek cities scattered along the coast of Ionia in Asia Minor. When these Ionian Greeks rebelled against the great king, Darius, seeking aid from their mainland brethren, Athens alone dared to answer the call, an act of defiance that marked the beginning of a titanic struggle between the nascent, disorganized liberties of the West and the unified, seemingly infinite resources of the autocratic East. This engagement was not merely a territorial dispute, it was a profound contest over the very nature of human governance and self-determination. When the Persian wrath finally descended upon the mainland, landing first at Marathon, the Athenians, heavily outnumbered but buoyed by the fierce belief in the defense of their homeland and their new democracy, stood alone and achieved a staggering, psychologically critical victory over the invincible invaders. This singular triumph proved to the Greeks that unity and courage, even without overwhelming numbers, could withstand the greatest earthly force, lending immense moral authority to Athens and galvanizing the disparate Greek states into a fragile, necessary coalition against the looming second invasion led by the vengeful Xerxes, son of Darius. The decisive confrontation finally took place upon the sea, in the narrow strait of Salamis, where the Athenian fleet, under the brilliant strategy of Themistocles, lured the massive Persian navy into waters too confined for their superior numbers to maneuver effectively. The ensuing naval battle was a desperate, chaotic slaughter, culminating in the destruction of the Persian fleet and shattering Xerxes' hopes of conquering the Greek heartland, forcing him to retreat across the Hellespont and leaving his remaining land forces vulnerable. This victory solidified Athens' position as the unquestioned naval powerhouse of the Aegean world, a supremacy that carried within it the twin possibilities of both glory and overweening pride. With the threat of Persia vanquished for the immediate future, Athens rapidly leveraged its newfound prestige and naval power to organize the Delian League, ostensibly a defensive alliance of various island states and coastal cities sworn to protect the Aegean from any future eastern aggression. However, over time, this alliance subtly transformed into a vast Athenian empire, as the League's treasury was moved to Athens and reluctant members were brutally compelled to remain in servitude, allowing the Athenian populace to enter into an unparalleled epoch of material wealth and artistic brilliance, funded largely by the contributions, or rather the tributes, of their subjugated allies. This immense accumulation of resources ushered in the Age of Pericles, the absolute pinnacle of classical Hellenic culture, transforming Athens into the jewel of the Mediterranean, where architectural marvels like the Parthenon rose upon the sacred Acropolis, a gleaming testament to human reason and artistic perfection dedicated to the patron goddess Athena. It was in this golden age that democracy reached its most radical and comprehensive form, with all male citizens participating directly in the ecclesia, the assembly, and serving by lot in the juries and councils, creating a political system based fundamentally on the equality of free men under the law. Yet, even in this radiant century of unparalleled philosophical inquiry, dramatic innovation, and architectural grandeur, the seeds of inevitable tragedy were continually sown, most dangerously in the widening gulf of distrust between democratic Athens and oligarchic Sparta. The growing imperial ambition of the Athenians, their constant interference in the affairs of other city-states, and their refusal to dismantle their sprawling naval empire eventually made war unavoidable, initiating the decades-long, devastating conflict known as the Peloponnesian War, a protracted struggle that tore the fabric of the Hellenic world into irreparable shreds. The war was a merciless clash of fundamentally opposed ideologies and military strengths. Athenian naval dominance pitted against Spartan infantry supremacy. A war of attrition exacerbated by the devastating plague that swept through the crowded city of Athens, tragically claiming the life of Pericles himself, and weakening the moral resolve of the citizens. The conflict consumed resources and manpower across the entire Aegean, turning former allies against each other and dissolving the shared bonds of Hellenic identity forged during the Persian Wars, giving way instead to fierce, localized hatred and desperate, destructive maneuvering. The long, grueling war finally culminated in the disastrous Athenian expedition against Sicily and the final naval defeat at Aegospotami, leading to the utter surrender and humiliation of Athens, whose famed long walls were torn down, and her democratic system temporarily replaced by the brutal oligarchy of the 30 tyrants imposed by the victorious Spartans. While Sparta achieved momentary dominance, its leadership proved clumsy and brittle, unable to manage the vast empire it had seized, leading to a rapid succession of hegemonic shifts as Thebes and then others briefly seized control, demonstrating that the unity and strength of the classical polis had been fundamentally, perhaps fatally, compromised by 4 decades of internecine violence. In the wake of this exhaustive conflict, The greatest minds of Athens turned inward, seeking certainty not in political action, but in the realm of ethics and eternal truth, grappling with the moral decay they had witnessed in the name of political expediency. Socrates, the eccentric, compelling philosopher, challenged the Athenians with relentless questioning, forcing them to examine their own unexamined lives and definitions of virtue, ultimately paying the highest price for his intellectual honesty when the fractured democracy condemned him to death on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. Socrates' death spurred his brilliant student, Plato, to establish the Academy, the first organized institution of higher learning in the Western world, where he developed his profound theories of forms and ideal states, arguing that true knowledge lay beyond the sensory world, residing in perfect, immutable concepts accessed through rigorous philosophical contemplation. Plato sought to guide humanity toward justice by advocating for a society ruled by philosopher kings, arguing that only those whose minds were trained to perceive the ideal could govern the imperfect realities of the visible world without succumbing to corruption. Following Plato came Aristotle, his most gifted pupil, who brought philosophy down from the realm of pure idealism and grounded it firmly in the observation of the natural world, organizing knowledge into systematic disciplines spanning logic, politics, ethics, poetry, and biology. Aristotle established the Lyceum, advocating a practical philosophy focused on achieving human flourishing, eudaimonia, through the cultivation of virtuous habit and the pursuit of knowledge based on empirical evidence, creating a comprehensive intellectual system that would shape European thought for the next 2 millennia. Upon Philip's sudden assassination, the throne was inherited by his 20-year-old son Alexander, a charismatic youth who had been personally tutored by Aristotle and possessed an insatiable hunger for glory and the heroic lineage of Achilles. Driven by the explicit mission of invading and conquering the vast Persian Empire, Alexander swiftly put down initial Greek rebellions and crossed the Hellespont, leading a relatively small but highly disciplined army into Asia, marking the beginning of the most explosive military campaign in recorded history and forever changing the boundaries of the known world. In a series of breathtaking victories at Granicus, Issus, and finally the colossal confrontation at Gaugamela, Alexander shattered the might of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, forcing King Darius III to flee and ultimately fall, thus making Alexander the undisputed master of Asia Minor, Egypt, and the sprawling territories reaching toward India. He founded numerous cities, most famously Alexandria in Egypt, which became a thriving center of learning and trade, deliberately mingling Greek settlers with indigenous populations in an ambitious attempt to unify his vast domain. Alexander's tragically early death in Babylon left his immense empire without a clear successor, immediately fracturing his domains into a series of warring kingdoms ruled by his generals, the Diadochi, who engaged in decades of violent, self-serving struggles over the fragments of his inheritance. The resulting Seleucid, Ptolemaic, and Antigonid kingdoms, stretching from the Levant to Egypt and Macedon, were ruled by Greek elites, maintaining Greek as the language of commerce, administration, and learning, ensuring the persistence of Hellenic culture far beyond the borders of the mainland. Meanwhile, back in the heartland of Greece, the city-states experienced a temporary resurgence of independence, though they were now fundamentally weakened, existing primarily as pawns in the grand strategic contests between the large Hellenistic kingdoms of the successors. New forms of political organization emerged, such as the Achaean and Aetolian leagues, which attempted to bind the polis into federal states, offering collective security in a world increasingly dominated by immense military powers and professional armies, far exceeding the scale of the classical era. The arrival of a formidable new power in the West, The expansionist Roman Republic soon altered the balance of the Hellenistic world, as the Romans, initially drawn in by disputes in Illyria and Macedon, began systematically reducing the power of the successor kingdoms. The Greeks, weary from centuries of continuous warfare, struggled to unify their defense against this new, highly organized enemy, often finding themselves caught between the brutal Roman legions and the fading Macedonian monarchs. The final, decisive confrontation came in the 2nd century BC, as the Romans dismantled the Macedonian kingdom and systematically crushed any resistance from the Greek leagues, culminating in the destruction of Corinth in 146 BC, a tragic, symbolic act that marked the end of Greece's political independence. Greece formally became the Roman province of Achaia, now merely a part of a much larger global dominion, its citizens subjected to Roman law and taxation, ruled by Roman governors appointed from afar. However, conquest did not mean cultural extinction. Rather, Greece captivated its conquerors, giving rise to the famous dictum that captive Greece had taken captive her rude conqueror, introducing the arts to rustic Latium. Roman elites admired and adopted Greek philosophical schools, artistic styles, rhetoric, and literature, ensuring that the legacy of Athens and Sparta would live on, spreading Hellenic thought throughout the burgeoning Roman Empire. Wealthy Romans traveled extensively to Athens to study philosophy, turning the ancient city into a revered university town, a beacon of intellectual history preserved under the Roman peace. During the Roman imperial period, Greece enjoyed a relative stability. The violence of the wars of succession ceased, allowing infrastructure and trade to flourish once again, while cities like Athens and Corinth were rebuilt and adorned with grand Roman public works. Philosophical schools like Stoicism, which emphasized duty, virtue, and acceptance of fate, proved particularly influential in shaping Roman imperial administration and the ethical framework of the emerging Roman legal system. The Greek language, known as Koine, became the universal tongue of the Eastern Mediterranean, essential for commerce and for the spread of new religious movements. The arrival of Christianity, initially a small Jewish sect, found fertile ground in the Hellenistic cities, particularly after the missionary journeys of Paul, who preached in Athens, Corinth, and Thessalonica, utilizing the widespread Greek language and philosophical concepts to explain the new theological doctrines. Greek became the language of the New Testament, binding the early Christian writings into the rich tradition of Hellenic thought and rhetoric, providing the crucial philosophical vocabulary needed to define key doctrines about the nature of God and man. As the Roman Empire eventually split into Western and Eastern halves, Greece found itself firmly rooted in the Eastern, or Byzantine Empire, centered upon the formidable new capital of Constantinople, a city founded by Constantine the Great upon the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium. This new civilization saw the fusion of Greek culture, Roman law, and the Orthodox Christian faith, creating a new identity that preserved and perpetuated Hellenic learning even as the West descended into the turmoil of the Dark Ages. For 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire shielded Greece, making Greek the official language of the state and ensuring that the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer were continuously studied and copied by devout, often monastic scribes, whose meticulous labor was the primary vehicle for preserving these texts for the modern world. Though politically ruled by emperors whose authority was derived from both Roman tradition and divine mandate, the administrative and cultural life of the empire was overwhelmingly Greek, maintaining a continuous intellectual thread back to antiquity. During the Byzantine era, Athens faded from its former political glory, surviving as a provincial city, while Thessalonica and Constantinople thrived as centers of trade and religious authority, fostering a unique, spiritually intense form of religious art, most notably the glittering mosaics and serene icons that sought to capture the transcendental glory of the divine. This period saw a deep intertwining of faith and identity, where being Greek became inseparable from belonging to the Orthodox Christian communion, providing a spiritual anchor during periods of internal decay and external siege. However, the increasing pressures from foreign invasions, the Slavs, the Arabs, and the Normans, gradually weakened the Byzantine hold on the Balkan Peninsula, leading to periods when large parts of the Greek mainland were cut off from centralized control. The greatest internal blow came with the treacherous Fourth Crusade in the early 13th century, when Western European knights, diverted from their original purpose, sacked Constantinople and partitioned the empire into small feudal states known collectively as the Franco-Crachia. The Frankish period introduced Western feudal structures and Latin Catholic dominance over Orthodox populations, creating a complex patchwork of territories ruled by Burgundians, Venetians, and Genoese, often based in heavily fortified castles built upon ancient Acropolis sites. Venice, in particular, seized control of vital coastal areas and the Cycladic Islands, using them as key maritime trading posts and naval bases, ensuring that Greece remained a battleground between the great powers of the Mediterranean. Despite the political fragmentation, this period saw a limited cultural renaissance in some areas, notably in Crete, which remained under Venetian control for centuries, giving rise to the Cretan school of art, a unique blend of Byzantine tradition and Renaissance influence. However, the overarching geopolitical trend was one of increasing vulnerability, as the remnants of the Byzantine state, centered in places like Nicaea and eventually restored in Constantinople, lacked the strength to fully resist the rising power that was establishing itself in Asia Minor. That rising power was the Ottoman Turks, who steadily encroached upon the weakened Byzantine and Frankish territories, culminating in the monumental fall of Constantinople in 1453, an event that marked the definitive end of the Roman-Byzantine imperial tradition and ushered in the final long age of foreign domination for the Greek world. One by one, the territories of the mainland and the islands fell under Ottoman control, becoming provinces of a vast Islamic empire ruled from the reconstructed city now known as Istanbul. Under the Ottoman millet system, the Orthodox Church, led by the Patriarch of Constantinople, was granted authority over the entire Greek Christian population, serving as both their religious and administrative head, effectively acting as the keeper of Hellenic identity and cultural continuity throughout the centuries of Ottoman rule. Although subject to heavy taxation and various legal restrictions as non-Muslim subjects, the Greeks were largely allowed to practice their faith and preserve their language, a concession that proved vital to the survival of their national consciousness. This period was marked by intellectual stagnation in the heartland, as access to Western European scholarship was limited. Yet the memory of classical antiquity and the Orthodox faith remained fiercely guarded by monastic communities and expatriate Greek scholars who had fled to Italy and beyond, contributing significantly to the Renaissance in Western Europe. Resistance often took the form of clandestine education, crifo scolae, ensuring that basic literacy and historical knowledge were passed down in secret, preserving the spiritual and linguistic ties to the Hellenic past. As the centuries of Ottoman rule progressed, the economic decline of the empire and the rigidities of its administration created deep resentment, fueling a slow but constant growth of Greek national sentiment, inspired by the ideals of the Enlightenment and the successful revolutions in America and France. Wealthy Greek merchants and intellectuals, known as the phanariots, played influential roles within the Ottoman administration, while others in the diaspora began to dream openly of a fully independent Greek state. The seeds of revolution were planted by figures like Regus Pharaios, who translated Enlightenment texts and envisioned a pan-Balkan state free from Ottoman rule, utilizing the classical heritage as the inspirational banner for modern liberation. Though he was ultimately executed, his work and the clandestine organization of the Philiki Atyria, Society of Friends, prepared the ground for the great uprising that was to come, binding together disparate elements, from wealthy merchants to mountain bandits known as klefts, under a shared vision of freedom. The military success of the Greeks, however, was tenuous and frequently undermined by internal political infighting, requiring the decisive intervention of the great powers, Britain, France, and Russia, who, motivated by strategic interests and public sentiment, intervened militarily at the Battle of Navarino, effectively destroying the main Ottoman and Egyptian fleets. This intervention forced the Ottoman Empire to recognize the establishment of a fully independent, but initially small and politically unstable, Kingdom of Greece in 1832. Throughout the 19th century, the guiding principle of Greek foreign policy became the megali idea, the great idea. The irredentist goal of uniting all historically Greek populations, especially those still under Ottoman rule, with the mainland state, expanding the borders to ultimately encompass Constantinople and the entirety of Asia Minor. This powerful, romantic vision fueled decades of diplomatic tension, military preparation, and cultural identification with the glorious expanse of the Byzantine past, often overshadowing the pragmatic needs of internal development. The early 20th century saw a period of significant military success under the leadership of Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, who guided Greece through the Balkan Wars, successfully liberating territories in Macedonia, Epirus, and the Aegean Islands from Ottoman control, almost doubling the size and population of the nation. This expansion brought the nation closer to realizing the megali idea. Yet it also placed Greece on a collision course with the remnants of the Ottoman Empire and the burgeoning Turkish nationalist movement. Following the upheavals of the First World War, Greece embarked upon the disastrous Asia Minor campaign, attempting to solidify its control over Turkish coastal regions where large Greek populations had lived for millennia, leading to a catastrophic military defeat against the forces of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The resulting Treaty of Lausanne mandated a brutal, comprehensive population exchange in 1923, forcing nearly 2 million Greeks from their ancient homes in Asia Minor, while sending hundreds of thousands of Muslims to Turkey, an event that forever altered the demographic and psychological map of modern Greece. This immense influx of refugees, while causing immediate trauma and economic strain, also brought new skills, cultural vigor, and a renewed political drive that eventually helped reshape the fragmented political landscape into a more centralized, though still often volatile, modern state. The shattering of the megali idea forced Greece to turn inward, focusing on its smaller, defined borders and wrestling with political instability, often shifting violently between democratic experimentation and authoritarian, sometimes military, rule. The nation was then plunged into the crucible of the Second World War, suffering a brutal, heroic occupation by the Axis powers, during which the Greek resistance movement achieved considerable distinction against the Germans. But the ensuing famine and devastation left the infrastructure in ruins and the population politically polarized. Immediately following liberation, the country descended into a devastating civil war between communist and royalist forces, a conflict often viewed as the first major proxy war of the Cold War, which cemented Greece's future firmly within the Western geopolitical sphere. The post-Civil War decades were marked by economic struggle and deep political tension, eventually leading to a dark 7-year period of military dictatorship imposed by the junta of the colonels in 1967, which brutally suppressed civil liberties and failed in its foreign policy regarding Cyprus. The collapse of the dictatorship in 1974 ushered in the restoration of democracy, the Third Hellenic Republic, and a referendum that abolished the monarchy, establishing a parliamentary republic committed to European integration. Greece finally achieved its long-held ambition of joining the European Economic Community, now the European Union, in 1981. A move that provided massive economic subsidies, security, and institutional stability, firmly anchoring the ancient land within the modern framework of Western political and economic alliances. This integration marked the final, peaceful step in the long journey from the isolated, revolutionary state of the 19th century to a recognized, essential component of the greater European project. Yet, even in its modern stability, Greece continually struggles with the colossal weight of its own history, forever balancing the legacy of its classical, Byzantine, and Ottoman pasts, seeking to define its role not merely as a museum of antiquity, but as a vibrant, contemporary nation. The enduring lesson of the Hellenic history, from the quiet marble figures of the Cyclades to the bustling squares of modern Athens, remains the continuous, restless human search for justice, for meaning, and for that elusive, perfect form of governance. A search that continues to define the spirit of this ancient land, perpetually reminding us that the greatest story is the one still being lived. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The years immediately following Greece's accession to the European community witnessed a powerful restructuring of the political landscape, dominated by the rise of the Pan-Hellenic socialist movement, led by the charismatic figure of Andreas Papandreou, whose fiery rhetoric captured the imagination of a populace hungry for self-assertion. This new era swept away many vestiges of the conservative post-junta establishment, introducing sweeping social reforms and adopting a fiercely independent, often anti-Western stance in foreign policy, even while simultaneously embracing the significant economic transfers flowing from Brussels. It was a time of deliberate, hopeful paradox, where national pride and anti-establishment sentiment blended seamlessly with the tangible benefits of European modernity, fundamentally reshaping the political and cultural contours of the nation. With institutional stability secured and the national coffers increasingly bolstered by generous structural funds, the nation embarked upon a massive program of infrastructural renewal, attempting finally to bridge the gap left by centuries of intermittent conflict, foreign subjugation, and underdevelopment. Great tunnels were bored beneath the ancient soil of Athens, transforming the capital into a truly modern European metropolis, with efficient transport networks and vast new highways began to span the rugged peninsulas, linking previously isolated regions into a cohesive, functioning whole. Prosperity, long promised and often fleeting in earlier epochs, now settled upon many households, fostering a vibrant, expansive consumer culture that slowly began to replace the Spartan simplicity necessitated by earlier hardship and revolutionary poverty. Yet, this era of integration and peace in the European West did not translate to complete tranquility on the volatile Balkan frontier, where the violent dissolution of the federated state of Yugoslavia created a highly unpredictable geopolitical environment demanding acute vigilance from Athens. New diplomatic tensions immediately flared regarding the naming and historical legacy of the newly independent republic to the north, challenging Greece's deep historical connections to the name of Macedonia and prompting large, passionate demonstrations across the nation's cities and towns. This unanticipated crisis served as a profound and enduring reminder that even within the protective, modernizing embrace of Europe, the inescapable weight of history, coupled with the profound complexities of regional identity, remained powerful, latent forces capable of stirring the collective soul of the Hellenes. Driven by a profound, almost spiritual desire to stand at the very center of the European project and achieve the full measure of Western recognition, the nation successfully transitioned to the single European currency, the euro, in the opening years of the new millennium. This acceptance into the economic core was seen not merely as a rational fiscal arrangement, but as the final, irrevocable seal of approval from the industrialized world, suggesting that Greece had mastered the disciplined requirements of stable modern finance and governance. However, this monetary union, while bringing the immediate benefits of lower interest rates and access to massive pools of credit, simultaneously stripped the nation of its essential tool of monetary self-correction, sowing the subtle seeds of future vulnerability beneath the surface of apparent and newfound wealth. The culmination of this long period of confident striving and national investment was the triumphant hosting of the 2004 Summer Olympic Games, bringing the ancient festival back to its spiritual home after a painful absence of more than a century since the first modern Games. The world watched as the Olympic flame was lit beneath the timeless gaze of the Acropolis, symbolizing a powerful moment of national renewal, demonstrating the nation's newfound capability to organize and execute a complex global event under intense international scrutiny and pressure. Although largely deemed a success on the world stage and a source of immense national pride, the years of preparation involved colossal public spending and infrastructural commitments, many of which were regrettably financed by readily available cheap credit, further masking the underlying structural issues and fiscal imbalances within the national accounts. As the global economy surged forward in the middle years of the decade, Greece enjoyed a borrowed prosperity, buoyed by the intoxicating illusion that sovereign debt incurred by a Eurozone member was somehow without genuine consequence or risk to its future. Essential structural reforms necessary to streamline the cumbersome state bureaucracy, improve the historically poor rate of tax collection, and rationalize the burgeoning pension system were continually postponed or watered down, sacrificed upon the high altar of political expediency and the desire to maintain immediate social cohesion. This era witnessed a widening, dangerous chasm between the officially reported national finances and the harsh realities faced by productive businesses, creating a fragile economic structure held together only by the continuous and unsustainable flow of external money into the system. The severe tremors of the global financial crisis, which first violently shook the distant shores of the Atlantic in 2008, eventually reached the Aegean Sea, revealing with a brutal, unforgiving clarity the full extent of the nation's hidden liabilities and decades of fiscal mismanagement. Trust evaporated swiftly from the international markets, replaced by widespread panic, as investors recoiled from the shocking realization that Greece's debt load was not merely high but utterly unsustainable, causing its borrowing costs to soar to unprecedented, ruinous heights overnight. The peaceful, prosperous era of integration suddenly and violently shifted into a desperate existential struggle for financial survival, threatening not only the stability of Athens, but challenging the very integrity of the Eurozone itself, forcing Europe to confront the profound vulnerability of its newest foundations. Facing the imminent threat of sovereign default and the complete collapse of its banking system, The government was compelled to accept massive bailout loans from the International Monetary Fund and its European partners, ushering in the painful, unprecedented era of the Memoranda of Understanding. These agreements demanded immediate, deep austerity measures, sharp cuts to public sector wages, dramatic reductions in essential pensions, and steep increases in taxation, all meticulously designed to rapidly rebalance the national budget and restore global confidence. The sudden imposition of such harsh, systemic economic pain fractured the historic social contract, plunging the country into a severe, prolonged recession deeper than any experienced since the war years, forcing countless citizens to harshly reassess the once sacred value of their European dream. The squares of Athens and Thessalonica swiftly became the stages for vast, tumultuous, and often violent demonstrations, expressing a collective anger directed equally at the perceived betrayal of the European partners and the historical corruption and perceived incompetence of the native political elite. The established centrist parties that had governed the nation with unwavering dominance since the fall of the dictatorship, PASOK and New Democracy, saw their electoral strength utterly crumble, while the extreme edges of the political spectrum gained terrifying and unexpected support, both on the populist far left and the frightening, newly emerged radical far right. This tumultuous period saw a frantic, agonizing search for alternative governance, reflecting a national spirit that utterly refused to surrender to political despair, even as the very foundations of its modern identity shook violently under the weight of debt and discipline. From this widespread and profound discontent, a powerful new political force emerged, the coalition of the radical left, or Syriza, which promised an immediate, definitive end to the austerity programs and a defiant, nationalistic renegotiation of the nation's crippling debts with its creditors. Winning the popular mandate in 2015, this new administration sought to confront the European institutional structure head-on, demanding recognition of the acute human cost incurred by the imposed economic discipline, and advocating a massive debt write-down. The confrontation that followed was tense, often agonizing, and highly volatile, bringing the nation to the very precipice of expulsion from the Eurozone, highlighting the immense difficulty of reconciling national sovereignty with the binding, non-negotiable requirements of deep economic integration. Ultimately, after months of nerve-wracking negotiation and the agonizing choice presented by a rapidly conducted national referendum, the government reluctantly agreed to a third, albeit restructured, bailout program, ensuring Greece's continued and indispensable place within the monetary union. The turbulent decade of the crisis thus eventually concluded not in catastrophic exit, but with the grim realization that the European path, despite its profound, high costs and demanding constraints, remained the most viable anchor for the small nation, offering the only known framework for long-term security and potential recovery. The scars of this financial period, visible in empty storefronts, fractured political loyalties, and struggling households, served as a profound testament to the high price paid for the modernization of an ancient land, yet also affirmed the relentless, enduring strength of the Hellenic spirit to rebuild its dignity and continue its complex historical journey. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening, seeking respite and reflection in these timeless tales? The acute financial agony of the crisis years having passed, the battered Hellenic ship turned its course toward the tedious, often heartbreaking work of recovery, seeking stability after the fierce storms of near collapse and political radicalism. The electorate, exhausted by confrontation and high-stakes negotiation, sought a new form of stability, moving away from the often volatile brinksmanship of the previous administration toward a more conventionally oriented, market-focused governments, determined to prove that Greece could adhere to European norms. This shift was characterized by the painful, protracted implementation of structural reforms long mandated by the creditors, including the difficult privatization of state assets and a determined effort to streamline the notoriously complicated state bureaucracy, seeking at last to make the ancient state machine function with modern efficiency. The goal was no longer merely survival, but the patient construction of a robust, competitive economic model capable of generating genuine long-term wealth outside the perilous cycle of borrowing, attracting foreign investment back to the shores of Piraeus and Thessalonica. Yet, the deepest wounds inflicted by the decade of austerity manifested not in the ledgers of the state, but in the tragic mass migration of its most skilled citizens, the profound brain drain of an entire generation seeking opportunity elsewhere. Thousands of talented doctors, engineers, and academics, trained at great expense by the Greek public education system, carried their knowledge, dynamism, and hope to foreign lands, leaving behind an increasingly aging demographic and a palpable sense of depleted potential in the Greek cities and villages. This relentless exodus presented a unique and persistent challenge to the nation's long-term economic recovery, forcing the state to grapple with the painful reality that true societal health depends not merely on balancing budgets, but crucially on nurturing and retaining the intellectual capital essential for future innovation and technological advancement. While the economic foundations were slowly being shored up, the ancient maritime rivalries in the Aegean Sea reasserted themselves with renewed intensity, driven by the contemporary geopolitical imperative of discovering vast energy reserves beneath the deep blue waters of the eastern Mediterranean. Frequent, provocative naval posturing, escalating rhetoric over disputed continental shelves, and the steady militarization of certain strategic islands kept the nation perpetually vigilant, forcing Athens to dedicate significant, precious resources to defense when every coin was desperately needed for domestic reconstruction and social support. These extensive maritime borders, stretching like a fragile thread from Thrace down to the island of Cyprus, remained a constant crucible of tension, serving as a stark, enduring reminder that the history of this crossroads nation demands eternal watchfulness against external pressure and competing regional ambitions. In response to this persistent instability, Greek diplomacy became fiercely active and strategically engaged, seeking robust alliances within the established European structure and forging critical new strategic partnerships with nations both near and far, ranging from Israel to Egypt, all aimed at establishing a stable balance of power in the volatile surrounding region. This intricate weaving of international agreements sought to secure the nation's sovereign rights not through raw military might alone, but through the binding weight of international law and collective defense guarantees, subtly transforming Greece into a key strategic pillar for the European Union's wider interests in the complex Balkan and Levantine spheres. The nation sought diligently to transcend its historical role as a mere geographic frontier post and instead become recognized as an essential, indispensable bridge, stabilizing the critical flows of trade, energy, and geopolitical dialogue linking three ancient continents. However, just as the long decade of debilitating financial strain finally began to subside and a measure of confidence returned to the markets, a new, unforeseen global affliction swept across the world, forcing a sudden and profound stillness upon all of humanity, the devastating global pandemic of the 2020s. For a nation heavily reliant on the constant, life-giving flow of tourists seeking its ancient ruins and sunlit islands, the forced closure of borders and the drastic cessation of international travel delivered a brutal and immediate shock to the nascent economic recovery, silencing the bustling tavernas and emptying the historical sites of Athens, Crete, and Rhodes. The government was compelled to pivot rapidly, shifting its entire focus from the protracted crisis management of sovereign debt to the unprecedented, immediate challenge of public health protection, imposing strict, necessary limitations upon the famously communal and open nature of Greek life. During this period of profound, enforced retreat and global isolation, the people turned inwardly once more, finding resilience not in grand public gestures, but in the quiet, steadfast strength of the immediate family, and the deep well of historical memory that reminded them that worse plagues and relentless invasions had been endured and overcome countless times before. The nation's reliance on swift, modern digital communication accelerated dramatically during the lockdowns, fundamentally altering the traditional face-to-face modes of commerce, education, and social interaction, decisively pulling the old society further into the instantaneous age of global information exchange. This difficult period of necessary isolation, though undeniably painful and economically damaging, served unexpectedly to reinforce the crucial societal value of communal care and mutual responsibility, allowing the state to demonstrate a surprising level of organizational competence in the face of an existential, non-financial threat. Emerging cautiously from the shadow of the pandemic, the national focus shifted rapidly toward revitalizing the crucial tourism sector, which fortunately rebounded with fierce, pent-up energy as global travel hesitantly resumed, bringing much-needed foreign revenue back to the islands and mainland resorts. Yet, policymakers, having learned bitter lessons from over-reliance on single industries, recognized the inherent peril of depending too heavily on the sensitive tourism sector and began channeling significant investment into high-technology development, robust renewable energy infrastructure, and advanced logistics hubs. The ancient land, intrinsically blessed with abundant sun and reliable winds, now sought to harness these eternal gifts not merely for its own domestic use, but strategically to position itself as a major regional exporter of clean, renewable power, effectively linking the vast solar energy potential of the South to the massive industrial needs of the North. The global peace that followed the acute pandemic period proved tragically fleeting, as new, violent conflicts flared on the eastern borders of Europe, triggering mass movements of displaced peoples and fundamentally reshaping the entire global energy and security landscape. Greece, standing firm on the southern flank of both NATO and the European Union, became a crucial transit point for humanitarian aid and a steadfast voice for democratic stability, while simultaneously grappling with the immense humanitarian and logistical demands placed upon its borders by those desperately seeking sanctuary. The nation was called upon once more to delicately balance its formal duties as a loyal member of the European Commonwealth with its deep, ancient historical traditions of hospitality, xenia, toward those fleeing conflict and persecution. A complex and demanding task requiring both profound compassion and the most prudent governance. As the decade continued to unfold, Greece finally seemed to be successfully shedding the paralyzing, lingering stigma of the crisis era, its governmental bonds trading favorably in the international markets, its political foundation stabilized, and its international reputation substantially restored. The ancient democracy, having been severely tested by tyranny, invasion, debt, and plague, now stood at a fresh and challenging threshold, deeply conscious of its complex past, yet intensely focused on building a resilient future founded upon technological prowess and recognized geopolitical importance. The long, winding, and enduring historical narrative of Hellenism continued its persistent journey, a powerful testament to the fact that while the structures of stone, the currencies of finance, and the systems of governance may suffer and crumble, the essential spirit of inquiry, profound endurance, and illuminating light never truly fades from this enduring Mediterranean soil. The careful stewardship of national resources, combined with the hard-won understanding of the binding rules of international finance, allowed the country to exit the enhanced surveillance framework of the European institutions, achieving a level of fiscal autonomy not seen since the dramatic intervention of the 2010s. This graduation was more than a technical financial milestone. It represented a deep psychological release from the perceived tutelage of Brussels and Berlin, affirming the nation's capacity not just to adhere to the rules, but to govern its own economic destiny responsibly and sustainably. The regained freedom, however, arrived with the heavy responsibility of ensuring that the painful lessons of the past, chiefly the perils of unchecked public spending and systemic corruption, would be permanently integrated into the operating memory of the state, ensuring that the heavy weight of debt would not crush future generations. This newfound financial self-determination allowed the government to pursue necessary investments in climate change mitigation, urgently addressing the increasing severity of heat waves and devastating wildfires that had begun to plague the southern European summer months with alarming regularity. Protecting the natural landscape, the olive groves, and the fragile historical sites from the ravages of a warming climate became a defining mission, recognizing that the historical wealth of Greece resides not only in its marble ruins, but in the very resilience of its unique ecosystem. Efforts were intensified to transition away from polluting energy sources, embracing the country's natural advantage in solar and wind power, positioning Greece as a pioneer in sustainable development within the highly vulnerable Mediterranean basin. The relationship with the European Union, hardened and refined by the fire of the Crisi, emerged stronger yet fundamentally more pragmatic, characterized by a clear-eyed understanding that full integration demanded absolute adherence to shared rules, even when painful, but also offered protection and solidarity in times of existential threat. Greece began to leverage its profound cultural and historical legacy not just as a source of tourist attraction, but as a crucial intellectual bridge between the classical world and contemporary European identity, actively participating in shaping the Union's strategic dialogue regarding democracy, border security, and cultural heritage preservation. The ancient birthplace of democracy thus asserted its voice within the modern continental commonwealth, ensuring that the wisdom of its long history informed the decisions of the future. Yet the shadow of demography persisted, demanding fundamental changes to the social contract, requiring innovative solutions to sustain the social security systems and provide care for the rapidly aging population, many of whom had seen their pensions drastically reduced during the crisis years. The effort to reverse the brain drain intensified, with programs designed to entice the lost generation of skilled professionals to return, offering tax incentives, research opportunities, and the emotional appeal of contributing their talents to the rebuilding of their homeland. The great challenge remained how to revitalize the smaller towns and remote islands, ensuring that the economic recovery was inclusive and did not merely concentrate wealth and opportunity solely within the large urban centers of Athens and Thessaloniki, maintaining the deeply cherished geographical integrity of the nation. As the years moved onward, Greece continued its perpetual navigation of external pressures, maintaining its careful vigilance along the long, contested border with Turkey, balancing the necessary posture of defense with the continuous diplomatic quest for dialogue and de-escalation in the Aegean. The hope for stable, neighborly relations remained the driving force behind the policy, recognizing that lasting peace and economic prosperity for both nations depended ultimately on mutual respect for sovereignty and adherence to international agreements. This ongoing geopolitical tightrope walk served as a constant reminder that for Greece, history is never a settled account, but a continuous, active process of asserting identity and maintaining autonomy within a complex and ever-shifting regional balance of power.